OverSoul 7 and the Museum of Time by Jane Roberts, read by Martin John. Chapter 16, Brothers of the Mind, a Dream Investigation and Paranoia from the Past. The codicils were such a part of Monarch's mental life, and so self-explanatory, that it was extremely difficult for him to imagine what the world must have been like without them. He knew that the historians had left huge gaps in their story of man's progress. At the same time, as he prepared for the 500th anniversary, the quincentennial celebration of the codicil's origin, Monarch found himself considering the pre-codicil world with feelings of strong disquiet. He'd been thinking how spectacular the George's achievement truly was, considering the background of his times and the fact that few, if any, people then embarked in any serious mental travel, and the fact that all of the George's previous training and belief systems must have been directly contrary to his own intuitive discoveries. And, as always, standing in the museum's front hallway, Monarch felt the familiar thrilling sensations that indicated he was picking up information through an alternative neurological sequence. He could almost sense the presence of the George, still learning the inner mechanics of mental locomotion, wandering in a world none of his compatriots could find, until finally he came upon the codicils. But how? That question had never been answered. It was a vital question, Monarch mused, because if the codicils hadn't appeared in that ancient past, then surely he, Monarch, and all of the Earth people would have known an entirely different world. If mankind had even been able to survive at all without the codicils, which didn't seem too likely. Monarch shivered suddenly. The museum seemed almost eerie in the silence. Waiting. The workers had all left after cleaning the place from top to bottom, touching up, washing the windows. Fresh flowers stood in vases on all of the tables. Only now the vacuum cleaner turned itself off after soundlessly going over all of the floors. The place was supposed to represent the George's 20th century house, its ancient domestic arrangements, its stationary windows instead of moving window walls, its boxed-in yet cozy interior. Monarch noted the fresh flowers, native species that had perhaps once grown in the George's backyard. Yet there was no doubt about it, Monarch thought uneasily. The flowers themselves had a different air than the house itself. They seemed strangely modern. It was almost as if faded flowers would be more appropriate. Monarch smiled to himself, and at the same time he felt a stronger surge of alienness enter the immaculate hall in which he stood. His prominent narrow nose wiggled. He shivered again with mild surprise. "Is there anyone there?" he asked mentally. At the same time he felt around inside his own consciousness for any patterns of sensation, however faint. for any information that seemed to be coming through those natural passageways with which he did not usually identify his consciousness. Faint whisperings. Strange, for he began to hear words, which then mentally appeared as letters that took the shape of a man. So, Monarch speculated, a man with that shape must be speaking the words. A window frame appeared transposed over the man's figure. All of this was very faint, and even with the training given everyone throughout life, Monarch had trouble holding the images intact long enough to study them. Why the unaccustomed difficulty? He wondered. He closed his eyes to see the images better, then sighed as he interpreted the message. A man called Window was speaking, but to whom, and about what? And how did the event have any connection with himself? But there was something. Monarch suddenly felt weak and leaned against the hallway table. The channel that had opened had a different feel to it, a vacant quality, as if some important ingredient were lacking. A message from a dank world, and Monarch's head suddenly snapped up. A world before the codicils, a world seeking for them, and a personality living in that world, who was another aspect of himself. There was no doubt of it. Monarch knew the feel of his own essence, and if the codicils had taught man anything, it was the multidimensionality of the self, which was seeded throughout the centuries. And he recognized that particular yet definite alter essence that represented his own psychological acknowledgement of another self. A self, Monarch thought, that would always be other to him as he would be other to it. Yet they were connected through neurological pathways that appeared ghostily, roaming through the worlds of their individual thoughts. But why in a world prior to the codicils? What was that ancient self trying to tell him? Monarch broke off, correcting himself. That self existed simultaneously with his own life. The 20th and the 25th centuries coexisted. Brother of mine, speak, Window said mentally. No answer, only a steadily growing sense of anxiety. But about what? This time Monarch heard the words, the codicils, repeated several times, in a warning or at least highly anxious mental voice that now he accepted as his own. Were they about to be stolen? The codicils themselves couldn't be stolen, Monarch thought. They were in the people's minds. The precious ancient microfilms could, but why? Monarch frowned again. It couldn't be that. He must be wrong. Still pondering and uneasy, he walked up the front stairs, taking some comfort in his own muscular activity, automatically checking to see if everything was in readiness. How perfect it all looked. The George's house, preserved, as if he might return to it at any time. At any time! In another frame of reference, the George was here, Monarch thought suddenly. The idea had come to him many times before, but as a pleasant theoretical fantasy. It now occurred to him that fantasy or no, according to the principles laid down by the codicils themselves, the George lived in this house or its facsimile in the 20th century even as he, Monarch, climbed the steps in the 25th. Then, what was the George doing now? And who was worried about the codicils and why? Surely they were safe enough. But what would anyone possibly gain by stealing them? The people would lose a vital artifact, a beloved symbol. Astonished with himself, Monarch broke off his line of thought and, almost dazed, reached the top of the stairs. His thoughts had actually been paranoid. He'd actually, seriously, been considering the possibility that someone would really steal the codicils. And in a world where such social diseases had been completely eliminated for over a century. Whatever possessed him? To his knowledge, not one act of thievery had been committed in his lifetime. The causes had been eradicated almost naturally, as the codicils taught man about his own potentials and abilities. The resentments and hatreds that had caused individual crimes no longer existed in the same way. Not that men were saints, but they were at least acting like members of a dignified species. They respected themselves and others. Then how could he have seriously considered the possibility that the codicils would be stolen, and felt such an intense anxiety? Of course, Monarch thought, the ideas hadn't been his own. When would he really learn to recognize the messages that rose up through his own familiar consciousness? That paranoia wasn't of his own time. Perplexed, Monarch sat down on the Victorian period chair at the top of the stairs. He knew that there were psychic correlations between himself and his other selves, invisible psychological intersections, and that fear about the codicils had come from just such a channel. But why had he picked up that particular message now, just before the celebration of the finding of the microfilm at the dig? In 2 hours, the entire area would be mobbed with visitors from all over the world. In 2 hours, the codicils would be on view, of course. The holograph players would perform the ceremonial drama, the history of the finding of the codicils, and depict the life of the George. Monarch sighed and decided to check with his mate, Leona, to see if her latest dream work had yielded any results that might throw light on this odd anxiety of his. He and Leona were both dream archaeologists, but Leona had always been the best dreamer, Monarch thought. Sometimes at the last minute, she had come up with excellent dream data, as if a crisis stimulated her abilities. He frowned. His abilities didn't work that way. He liked peace and quiet. But there wouldn't be any until the celebration was over. And as he walked down the museum's hall, Monarch tried to throw aside the sudden nagging thought that the celebration itself was somehow threatened. He opened the door to the George's bedroom. Leona spent her dreaming time there, in the hopes that the location might stimulate new information. She was looking out the windows and turned, almost anxiously, as Monarch entered. "I'm done," she said, and the room is in order. But, Monarch asked. He knew her so well that her anxiety was apparent, even as she tried to soften its expression by a reassuring smile. Well, I may have received some new facts, disturbing ones. Or, at least, I may have some information that contradicts other things we think we know. I hate it when that happens. Her large brown eyes still carried hints of their dream visions. She seemed bathed in the softness of an alternate consciousness, not blurred, but carrying the look a child does when roused from sleep. Even her anxiety was softened by this aura of subjective refreshment. The dreams are already recorded, she said. I taped them at once. Her toes wiggled in her sandals. She tapped her right foot gently so that her ankle bracelets tinkled, and her short skirt rippled with the graceful motion. Just think, these windows opened once, or the originals did. Again she stared out at the museum's grounds. And let in all the dirt of traffic, Monarch said, laughing despite himself. It was a game they usually loved to play. They'd stand there, using their inner senses, trying to bring up to awareness's threshold of all the sounds of the ancient automobiles, the squeal of tires. Don't put me off, though. You're the best dreamer of the two of us. What did you come up with? She swung around. I am? And whose dreaming led to this dig and resulted in the museum to begin with? Yours. True, Monarch said, but I've always felt that something was incomplete. Maybe it was, Leona said seriously. You can check my dream records later. But there were 3 separate, clear dreams. In one, I stood in an ancient kitchen, much like the museum's, and there was a man named Window who was trying to look into our world. Monarch's face almost drained of color. What's wrong? Asked Leona, alarmed. Go on, responded Monarch. I'll tell you when you're through. Well, she said doubtfully, I'll tell you the second one in sequence, though it's somewhat complicated. This dream was almost like a nightmare. In a terribly vivid series of events I saw what the world would be like now if we didn't have the codicils. It really was something frightening, but I kept my head and my critical functionings throughout. She paused, then continued quickly. Most, of the ideas were sheer insanity. It was hard to understand, but in the dream, wars were considered a method of achieving peace. I mean, countries had armies, and the greater the war machines, the greater the chances of peace were considered to be. Idiocy, I told you. And in the dream, mankind hadn't learned how to handle technology at all. Somehow it was used to build up a country's arsenal of possible retaliatory equipment. Leona shook her head almost angrily. The entire affair was most distasteful, and I was really amazed to find myself encountering such nonsense so directly. There was more, she went on, but the third dream was the one I thought most significant. Monarch nodded, knowing that they'd checked dream details and cross-checked them 1,000 times in their 10 years keeping records. Well, in the third dream I was a woman, connected with the man window of the first dream, and my name was Josephine." Leona paused, then spelled out the name meaningfully. Monarch stared at her. "You were saying that there's been an error in the legends, that the man we have as the George's closest friend was a woman." Leona answered slowly, "Not Josephine at all, but Josephine, a woman. I'm really quite sure, though where the man window fits in, I don't know." "I can tell you that," Monarch replied. "From a brief experience I had on the way up there, I think that window is, one of my own aspects in the 20th century. And if Josephine was an aspect of me, if I'm right, then somehow both of us were involved with the George. In some capacity at least," Monarch said, and more slowly, "that could be why I picked up the location of this dig to begin with." Leona looked forlorn. "Then why have you had these dreadful feelings lately about the codicils being in danger?" Monarch sighed. "I don't know. The entire museum, the environment, the grounds, and the river sometimes lately seem transitory, as if they could vanish in a moment." "Then we have to conduct a together dream," Leona cried. "There's nothing else to do. We'll be our own dream guides. We'll sleep in this bed and try to dream to travel into the past clearly." "There's so many variables," Monarch said. "I don't do my best dream travel under pressure, either, like you do. And there's not much time before the celebration, either. The technicians must be gathering in the basement and downstairs room even now." She grinned at him. He started laughing. "Of course you're right. And who knows what we'll find? Maybe we'll even have more new data for the celebration." They took off all of their clothes and lay down in the replica of the George's bed. They let their thoughts melt. Then they let their thoughts melt together, and they felt their bodies dissolving into the bedding, becoming the bedding as far as sensation was concerned, though both of their physical forms lay there, cool and quiet as sleeping stones. Their minds met where their thoughts merged together, and their dream selves rose up like forms of smoke. The forms faded together into the room's past, into the pasts of the room, disappearing in numberless autumns and summers, floating through immeasurable winters and springtime, following the beckoning focuses of their individual and joint tenets. Monarch and Leona were naturally gifted dream travelers, their abilities tuned and developed through their university training. They loved working together, and now they maintained their separate critical consciousnesses carefully, clearly, easily, letting them ride atop the deeper, steadier dream consciousnesses that supported them. Their love for each other was a further support, adding to their closeness, so that now the dream consciousness of one of them could intermingle with the others. But always their intent steered them in one direction, toward the George's ancient world. Now and then, their dream bodies passed through utter darkness. There were bursts of flame and the chattering, it seemed, of a million voices, but both of them knew enough not to become distracted, not to investigate, not to be touched by such dream atmospheric conditions. "I love you," Monarch said mentally. "I love you," she mentally replied. Then they both felt that sudden exhilaration, that focusing of energy, that surge of triumph as the dream trip zoomed them in precisely on the desired location in time and space, incredibly finding the target from an infinity of probabilities. Now was a time of special care. In Chapter 16. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.